Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Constructive Criticism Podcast. I'm your host, Easy. This is episode 483. I didn't believe it when I posted it. Abe, how you doing, buddy? We're joined by the full cast today, but you're a little under the weather. I wanted to check in with you first.
Yeah, I'm battling a little bit of a cold. Picked up over the weekend, but thanks to the power of hashtag not sponsored Luden's cough drops, Luden's cherry
Could be sponsored.
Great pecking cough drop. I'll be able to make it through. I thought it'll be fine.
You know, it's funny. Like, as somebody that's wife is a teacher, there are two jobs that I'm quite sure get everybody around them sick, and then also get sick pretty often, and that is elementary school teacher and any human that works at a bank.
Money's disgusting.
What?
What about the hospitals as an honorary shout out too?
No, I actually would guess that you were more likely to get sick at like a bank or a school than a hospital. Mostly because like there's like rules of cleanliness that like, and there a lot of it's forced upon at this point at a hospital. But like people be walking into banks sick as F with their dirty money. It's gross.
Money is so gross.
Their blood money from all the rag vans they bought.
Mason Clark, how are you doing, buddy?
Doing pretty good. Ready to go to the gym after this. Boom, boom. Then I'm done. I get to relax, put my cube together. You can kind of see on the video podcast here. There's a quarter calling right here. I've got like 10 more cards to pull out, and then the cube is done. Got to find these 10 shock lands, and it's Jover. I have it ready, which is great. I'm excited to play this weekend.
How many fetch lands are in your cube?
0.
Interesting. Well, if you want to talk about things like the fetch lands in cube, you could maybe join the Discord. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. Maybe I'll question maybe somebody's cube in there. If you want to do that,
can I give a shout out real quick?
Oh yeah,
all right, cube real quick. Somehow Dom Harvey did a 2-hour solo podcast about Cube from CubeCon. We love Dominarius Judgment. We love Dom. Unbelievable. I turned it on at the gym expecting a normal Dominarius Judgment, and he's like, it's just me this week. And I looked at the timer, saw 2 hours, thought there's no way. Very enjoyable, very informative too if you like Cube stuff. I thought it was great. It blew my mind.
Mason solo.
It was a 2-hour lecture.
Yeah,
it was a 2-hour lecture about Cube philosophy, magic design, and his experience at CubeCon.
It's weird that the guy that has like the 38,000 page amulet article would also make a solo 2-hour podcast.
It just goes to show you can make any content you want if you have a British accent.
I don't even know what he said. It was just so British.
It just sounded so nice.
Yeah.
We could be better if we had British accents on the show. Fortunately, we're all dirty, gross Americans. That being said, this episode is about always improving to the point where we're not even going to do the always improving segment. Because this week, we're diving into improving. We're all going to talk about things that we've been working on a lot deeper than we normally do. We all talk about the things that we've done to be improving, but we're going to dive deep into those. Before we do that, as I mentioned, if you want to join the Discord, just join Patty B. Patty B MTG, we mentioned him last week, kind of off the cuff, but he gets his shout out. Patty B joined the Discord as a patron of $5 or more. If you're watching live, you probably are a patron of the show. That's another benefit. Bonus episodes. There's tons of things that you can do. Head on over to patreon.com/CCMTG. The show will always be free. But you know what? Joining a Discord with Discord with the three of us, that's worth way more than we charge. Mason smile. I love it.
I think you nailed that one.
I nailed it.
I think you did it.
Hashtag always promoting.
That's right.
Let's go into the training grounds, diving into improving. Mason, what is this episode?
Yeah, so this episode is almost like the Black Mirror anthology episode of the CCMTG universe, where we're each going to be going over sort of an always improving segment that's a little bit bigger and flushed out. And, this was really sparked by feedback from you, the listeners. If you've ever told me that you'd like the show in person, I probably said, "Hey, can I ask you an awkward question of what's your favorite part?" And you said, and then you told me what you thought after you thought about it a little bit. And the thing I get the most is the always improving segment. And some always improving segments are kind of short, sweet, to the point. Not everything is kind of a Goliath stuff, but we're all kind of at a point where it's kind of perfect to have a big always improving segment. And sometimes if you listen to the show, right, we don't get to the main topic till 20, 30 minutes into the episode. Definitely the exception more than the norm. But in the theme of that, it's like, well, instead of trying to like rush through this or have that, be an episode. I'm sorry, instead of not having it be an episode, let's just have it be an episode. Because some of these things too are stuff that are maybe really good topics for 15, 20 minutes. And we could wait to do one maybe when it's just the two of us here. Or we can do this now, have us all here and sort of knock it out, especially when we're in this sort of weird flux time right now with Magic. So with that in mind, I think I'll start off here with always improving / our segment. And I'll start talking about mine and, we'll go from there. So a couple weeks ago in coaching, I was having this thought and I was thinking a lot about kind of like what is going on between me and the average coaching person. Because my first realization is that I would say about 75, 80% of the time in coaching, me and the person that I'm coaching have the same line, right? Like we come to the same conclusion. And there's obviously some differences and stuff. And sometimes, like they might not have a well thought out reason and it is multiple choice, etc. But I was thinking, what is the difference? Because clearly there's some delineating factor between me and them, and there might be some other stuff going on, like fundamentals, etc. But what is going on if we're coming to the same place a lot of the time? And the thing that I first noticed when I was thinking about it was, well, they're getting there really quickly. And I would notice this where I would often say in coaching, where be like, "Excuse me, give me a second," or "Sorry, I was thinking through the line for a second there," after they gave their answer. And what I thought at first was, it's like, okay, well, maybe I'm just being more methodical about it, right? Maybe I'm thinking a little bit more, giving it a bit more time. And so what's happening is, it's because I'm thinking more, I miss some less of those small details, or I find some bigger picture line or something like that. And this snowballs over the course of the game of making a bunch of, micro mistakes or death by 1,000 cuts. And I think there's something to that. I think that's fairly true. But after reflecting more, I started to realize, well, why are they making their choices so quickly? What is happening? And that's when I landed on the conclusion of heuristics and thinking about it and talking to people and listening to what they're saying and really kind of diving into it. I realized that a bunch of players are using heuristics to drive their plays and to sort of guide them. And they're leaning on them in a way that is much more like it is a map than it is, or a compass, than it is a tiebreaker. What I mean by that is, when I would talk to players, would listen to them, or ask them why they did their play, they would give me these heuristic-based answers that weren't having any context of the game we're currently at. And, before we go forward, I think there are some really good heuristics. I think heuristics can be helpful. But when you blindly follow something like that and you don't be an active participant in the game, then you're really going to, struggle and have a hard time moving forward in the match and moving forward in Magic, because you're not really thinking about what's at hand and you're not letting those situations sort of dictate what's going on, right? A sort of great example of this might be something like, let's say you're playing against Yawgmoth, and your opponent mulligans to 4 and they play an Ignoble Hierarch. Well, if you have a Dreadbore type card in hand, you have an answer to Grist already, and you have like a Fatal Push as well. You have, I guess, Molten Collapse is the new one. Normally, heuristics would say you push the bird, you bolt the bird, you get rid of it. But if your opponent's on that many resources, you might actually want to save it and just fight over the key cards, right? Inversely, it might just be correct to bolt the bird, right? Like maybe they're just off of mana. And what's happening is, I think a lot of times the people I'm coaching and just Magic players in general, as I kind of look and watch and think about what the difference is between sort of the really strong players I know and just the strong players, or just the average person, is that the really strong players are taking each scenario sort of as its own individual instance, and they are kind of figuring out what it is in that moment, and then they are thinking about what they would do from there. And sometimes they use heuristics as a tiebreaker, or something to kind of tip the scales one direction or the other if it's really close, because heuristics can be helpful, but they're not leaning on them as immediate things. And that is why we're getting a lot of the same answers, is because sometimes, especially good heuristics like Bolt the Bird, typically end up being right so often that it's fine if you just default to that every single time, but it will be wrong some percentage of the time. And that was kind of the big one. So I want to kind of open up to you two, because I know I just spent a lot of time talking. I want to talk about some stuff that might help with this, but I don't want to just spend the whole time talking. So Any thoughts or anything like that?
I have a lot of thoughts, and I actually thought about yours a lot as we were coming up with the show and knowing where you were going to come from, and I think about the players that I play a lot of Magic with, right? And I think that I have two players that I play with a lot that have two extremes. In Matt Kling plays a lot by heuristics by playing a ton of Magic. And then you've got Quentin Pierce who plays a ton of Magic, but he does it to gain knowledge on situations. And when they play together, it's really cool to like listen to them talk. And kind of listening to you talk there, the way that I view heuristics, and honestly, like the actual first time I heard this word was like, it was probably like episode 180 something of Limited Resources when LSV brought it to the forefront of the Magic community on that episode. I don't remember the specific episode, but I remember thinking like, this is really cool. But the way that I've always viewed it is like, here are the things that are usually right that you can shortcut through your games because of. And then here are the situations that usually come up that are more complicated that once you learn them a bunch, maybe it can make you play a little bit faster. But that's how I've used heuristics. It's more of a shortcut for things that come up a lot rather than like Bolt the Bird is like a good example. It's probably one that we'll use a lot, but like, yeah, if you like have a fatal push and they have an elf in Pioneer, you should probably fatal push. Because the thing is let's say you fatal push on Thoughtseize and you Thoughtseize them instead, and you're like, well, fatal push has more value later. Well, guess what? What happens is you've Thoughtseize them, they have 3/3 drops. It didn't actually matter which one you took, and now you're really far behind. So that's why that heuristic is right such a high percentage of the time in a situation like that. Or you have, it's pretty often in like ramp decks where, the heuristic is like, okay, play a bridge spell, play a ramp spell, play a ramp spell, play a threat, right? And then when you break those heuristics and when you want to do things like that, it like the opportunities, I guess, to get good with our ramp deck, like even the standard ramp deck we have now, that's like this 5-color ramp deck, the opportunities that you have to break serve or break heuristics are actually the opportunities that you're going to gain win percentage in that deck. Everybody expects soon they're going to expect literal rampant growth into, explosive vegetation. I think that will actually become a norm a little bit in that deck. And the opportunities where you can be like, okay, are there 4 drops that I can play that break serve, or there, different things that I can do with Territorial Stomper, with vehicles. Like, those are the things where the deck will become more interesting now, because everyone will now start to have specific patterns. And we had it with 1-drop, 3-drop, 5-drop in standard. We had it with 2-drop, 4-drop, 6-drop in standard with, rampant growth, Sylvan Simulacrum, Titan. We had it with birds, cultivate, or it wasn't actually cultivate, it was actually 1-drop, 3-drop pod stuff. But just that type of stuff, the opportunities to learn and the opportunities to gain percentages come from when not in the games that everybody could win, right? They come from the games that you actually have to think to win a game. That's kind of my thought on this topic.
Yeah, I think like a really, really big kernel of wisdom in there that you touched on was just in how like LSV presented it when you first started thinking about it in terms of heuristics, and how I think that a lot of Magic players kind of lost sight of that since then, where heuristics are things you use to be able to offload processing of decisions you're going to make like through games into already being answered, right? You're making these shortcuts, you have good shortcuts to follow so that you can use your mental processing elsewhere. I think a lot of players especially ones who go from a point of, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing, to, all right, I'm going to play a lot and try to figure it out. They develop a lot of good heuristics about what the plays to make are, or how to play, a really strong deck pretty well and not make a lot of big mistakes and make kind of like the right decisions and know roughly what things should look like. And that gets you, like 75 to 8% of the way there. But if that's the only way you're playing, right, you'll win a good amount of your matches. But in a tournament, it's about winning a set of matches that you're playing over one short period of time, right? And that means that you really have to be paying attention to making the best decisions possible in front of you and playing the games in front of you for that tournament, to have a success in that in a way that you wouldn't have just by trying to be like, trophy leader on Magic Online, or even just building up a play point bankroll on Magic Online by just jamming leagues, right? You can play a bunch of not super engaged or super involved Magic and still win a lot when you play a good deck, but that hinders you. And if all you're ever doing with your heuristics are establishing these ways to avoid thinking during Magic and not balancing that out by introducing, right, that extra brain power you've now saved by shortcutting, if you're not using that to then include, okay, what is it I'm now using the brain power freed up to process? All you're doing for yourself is making it so that you're not working as hard to play average ABC Magic. And average ABC Magic is fine and good, but if you really want to, right, succeed and level up, you need to push yourself to be beyond that. And if you're not doing that, and you're only ever making conventional wisdom plays, and you're not trying to evaluate where you are in a game, and you're not using all of the information that you're able to take in, because you knew already what your first 3 land drops would look like, or what the important color in your deck to double up on is, or what kind of hands you can and can't keep against certain decks, and what you're looking for in your opener, and all these things that normally, if you were to just process them raw every time, would completely exhaust you and take a bunch of time. You're not actually using heuristics to much of your advantage. You might even win more in an untimed world of like just making every decision from a place of not actually thinking of it. And I think that's kind of like a really big tension that exists, especially in tournament Magic, where your brain power and your ability to process things is a finite resource. Like, we are human, and people get tired when they think about things, and it expends, energy to do so. But making sure that you're doing things that leverage the brain power you do have, and make sure you have it for the situations where you need it, that's where you're going to be able to play at your A game in order to do that, with heuristics as a tool. But I think, much to what, like your observation, Mason, I think a lot of players, they get to the point of understanding the conventional wisdom, and they're like, okay, that's good, that's what I should be doing, because that's what you tell yourself you're supposed to be doing for a long time. You're like, okay, how do I get to the point where I'm not making mistakes? I'm just playing, I'm playing well and I'm making good decisions. And if you never get to a point where you stop and say, okay, what if this is serving me, and what if this is, stopping me from engaging mentally in my games on a deeper level, or on a deepest level I can, then you stop pushing yourself to really improve. And I think that's like really, unsurprising to me, that people who come, ready for coaching, ready to take that next step, you're finding that a lot of them have maybe this barrier, even though they make, the same play as you, like you said, like 75% of the time, because 75% of the time, the obvious play is the right play when you think about it like that, right? The play, it's the play that's right most of the time. That's why it's a good heuristic. But if you don't, right, if you're missing out on 25% of the time where it's the wrong play, or what typically feels like the second best play is actually better, because you don't engage with it. And I think that's like, I've thought about that a lot too. I know we've talked about it not every week, but maybe the last 2 or 3 shows. We've mentioned this at least once, but I think that's because there really is a good kernel here that I want to make sure that we get to listeners, because, it's, if you're leveling up and if you're playing tournament Magic, you really got to make sure that you're developing yourself to play good tournament Magic. And heuristics are a tool, but I think people often use them more as a resource than as okay, this is the encyclopedia of plays I can make, rather than, this is the encyclopedia of shortcuts I can take, so that in round 9 of today, I have a little bit more brain power to think things through, or even on turn 9 of this game, I can think things through a little better because my turns 1 to 3 were already played out.
I think that one thing that I want to hit on that you just hit on, that I think, well, let me say it this way. If you're listening to this and you're like, oh, does this apply to me? If you consider yourself a control player or a ramp player or a aggro player or any of those things, the reason that you feel that way is because you've built up a stockpile of heuristics for your deck that gives you an advantage in X number of situations, right? When Abe talks about like the mulligan decisions, the what to do in X or Y situation and all of these things, there's a reason that I've talked a lot about like why I think that control and ramp are like easier decks to play, and it's because you can build up those heuristics really easily. And if you're going to break, then the games that you win, right, are the games where you break those heuristics and you understand what's important on key turns. And I think that if you're listening to this, this doesn't apply to me. If you consider yourself a type of player and only that type of player, it definitely applies to you. I just want to call that out.
I think it applies to most players.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I would guess it applies to you two and me as well.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just so we're all clear. Okay.
I wanted to highlight like sometimes I think it's easy to like think like, oh, I don't have this problem, and I wanted to highlight like an obvious situation where this is true.
Sure. I would say this. A lot of times when I see players, like I think there's a great example. I guess not actually a great example because I can't remember all the details. Basically, I watched Corey Baumeister make a heuristic-driven play at one of the Apexes we were both at, and I talked to him about it afterwards. And he basically said like, oh, like that's typically the thing in the spot for like these reasons or whatever. And I was like, yeah, but your opponent did Y or whatever, and I was like, and if they did that, it meant they didn't have the card that normally this plays around because they would have just slam it. And he goes, great point, and like gives me the finger gun. And that's like a spot where it's like, even people like him or whatever, right? Or like us, depending on wherever you want to put people on pedestal, etc. Like this happens to everyone, and it's an important thing to just be aware of. And like I will slip up and I will make plays that are driven off heuristics, especially when like time happens. And I think that like one of the good things about heuristics, is like it helps with the mental load, like y'all talked about it. And for what it's worth, I didn't get a chance to say it, but I love everything y'all said. But like it helps with the time, and it also like when there's 10 minutes on the clock and you need to play game 3, you do not have the same amount of time you do as when you have 50 minutes on the clock, right? And like you can take that extra 2 or 3 seconds, the time, you've used your time already. It's time to like really hone in and finish the match at hand. So with that in mind, it's like, okay, I need to play quicker, which means having heuristics and building up and understanding these sort of things does matter. And if you do any coaching with me or have listened to this podcast, you know that I don't really care about like winning and losing. What I care about is like what matters in the matchup, kind of how do these cards line up? How does this deck line up against this deck? How do you play these cards against each other, right? Sort of what matters in the matchups what I care about, which in a lot of ways is just building up a heuristics, right? I'm asking you sort of what are the key things that seem to be coming up with these key points, because I want to know how the cards work so that I can make informed decisions from that, right? So a lot of the ways that I even prepare for tournaments, you could argue are like heuristic driven or whatever. But it is just very important to understand that like when you are not, as Abe said it, using like your active brain or whatever, you're just shortcutting everything, then you're not really playing as much. And you're gonna set yourself up for more failure in the really hard spots, right? The easy lines where everything's going well, you're gonna do fine. But when it gets tough, gets nitty-gritty, you're gonna lose. Or your opponent who's maybe actively thinking is going to win that 5% of games that even though they were a heavy favorite to lose, they kind of sneak out because you were autopiloting and didn't play around X or Y card. Really quickly here, if I don't want to spend too much more time on mine, I wanted to have some quick actionable things to try and help you all with this, because I understand that like this is kind of a big thing. It's like wave our fingers at you, no, but like we didn't really, not like a normal episode, so I would have a brief version of that really quickly here. The first is, it's okay if you get overwhelmed. Do your best not to be. It can be overwhelming when you start thinking about a lot of things and coming from it. I will say that ideally when you're playing Magic, you should be thinking about the whole game the whole time, and it'll be like a running or rolling tally. So this won't be as big of a deal when you're actually playing versus jumping into a scenario or jumping into a game, right? This is why so often in events, people will say in team tournaments, like, I don't help my teammates unless they specifically don't know or ask, because they didn't have the full context if I jumped into a game. So think about those things. It's okay, but do your best to kind of think through like what's happened in this game, what makes sense. If they had this card that I'm playing around, would they have played it earlier? Does that make sense? Should I sort of call their bluff, right? Or should I keep respecting it, etc.? Just think about each individual instance as its own thing and try and think through it. And it doesn't have to be 10, 15 seconds for every single play. It can just be a little bit of thought, and you can get the ball started there and just, even think about, work on one match at a time, really doing it like that, and then move on to the next, right? And we don't, for what it's worth, like, I understand what I'm saying. I'm painting with a wide brush here, right? And I'm saying never really think. But for stuff like, you're going to upkeep ultimate price the Shieldred so you don't die to the Shieldred trigger, you don't need to stop and think, like, is this the right scenario? Like, you could just kill the Shieldred, Like, for the really obvious things you have to do if you're going to win the game, that's fine. But when you find yourself, I would say this, if you find yourself making a play and you can't say why I made that play or what was going on or that you didn't think about that play, then I think you're doing it wrong. And that's a good time to check yourself before you wreck yourself.
I love it. I guess I'll go next. My topic this week is something that I talked about, I think, 2 weeks ago, that I have tried and been focusing on a little bit more, and that's playing with intent. And I want to talk about a few things as we kind of go through this. The first one is intent and discipline. Because one of the things that I really liked is what Abe said. I think Mason actually joined in too. I think both of you kind of talked about intent during that Always Improving segment and playing with intent. And I think that there is a difference between discipline, which is, not going into autopilot, and then intent, which to me is like, okay, now that we're not in autopilot, let's actually engage in the game in a meaningful, real way. And I think that both things are important, and that I had to get back to playing with discipline in order to get to playing with intent. And I think that's important. I think that recognizing that I wasn't even disciplined enough to play with intent was a pretty big problem for me when playing matches of Magic. And a reason is because I think that a lack of discipline comes when you're playing matches of Magic where you're able to skill diff your opponent a lot, where you don't have to focus on intent, you don't have to focus on discipline, you can flowchart it, you can rely on heuristics like Mason said, and you can kind of just go through the motions and keep yourself at a place where you're happy. For me, and kind of where I'm at in Magic, I posted this in the Discord, I'm kind of shifting my Magic focus. Right now, the things that I need to work on is MTGO and kind of a return to form of really disciplined Magic. And when I say MTGO, this weekend I played the challenge, and my son was playing Fall Guys behind me. One time, he's trying to talk to other people on the Discord while I'm playing Magic, and they can't hear him, so I'm like trying to talk for him, and I don't force a negation something I need a force a negation. Like, I click through it. Another time, he's screaming while playing Fall Guys happily, and it's so loud, like, I can't think, and I have a commandeer in hand that I don't pitch. Or I don't counter a commandeer that I had a counterspell for. And it's so funny because, like, in a paper Magic tournament, I would never have this problem. Like, there's just not a time where, like, I would not. I'm in that situation so much. I have my pen, my notepad, or whatever, my deck box. I have the way that I shuffle. I have all these things that I do that I'm just in this mode. And as I kind of shift the way that I play Magic to not focus on the little tiny bits of, like, the things that I focused on for a long time with paper Magic, but focus on things that are important to winning larger matches of Magic holistically. That return to form and that belief that like MTGO is the level of competition that I need to get to where I want to go is really important. And I think once I've done that, I think working on intent is next. Whether that's pre-tournament, whether that's looking at deck lists. I've gotten a lot better at studying recently, to the point where I've played a Shealdred Rhinos deck multiple times now, where I believe like it has a good position in the metagame. Mulligan decisions and in-game decisions are something that I'm really good at, outside of like those moments where I slip and where those moments where intent disappears and that discipline isn't there. And that's why I'm working on it so hard. I've seen results in my green red vehicles testing where it's Alicia watching Lion King behind me instead of Maxwell, watching while playing Fall Guys, and like the differences in there. I think that the reason this is important for me is that I don't want us to become lazy, but in some respects it is that. Like, it's so easy to be like, oh, I don't know, like I'm winning 80% of these matches on Arena for this. Like, that'll obviously translate. Or like, I'm top 8ing all of these RCQs, that'll translate. Rather than thinking like, okay, well, what happened in those matches? What happened? What made your decisions? And I think back to like the finals of the RCQ that I lost with Gruul vehicles, where I kept the one lander because I was like, well, if I draw land, like this game is over and I'm gonna win the tournament because I'm up a game. But like, if I had just had a disciplined mulligan decision, that wouldn't have happened. And it comes from those times where you put yourself in positions to get lucky because it doesn't matter. Because you didn't put yourself in the situation where it did matter enough times. So that's kind of mine. I kind of like went off there. So Abe, any thoughts or feelings on that?
I just want to say that I kind of love the way that you just put that at the end, as far as like, putting yourself in the spot where like you're making decisions where you need to get lucky because you don't feel like you need the discipline to have the success you want, or like, you maybe are out of practice of making sure you're making decisions with the discipline because you don't you don't often have to rehearse that kind of like consistent, I'm going to make the right decision all the time and like evaluate everything kind of mindset. Be it because most of the time you end up playing is when you're also on daddy duty and have like a million other things going on, so it's hard for you to get that time to focus and really practice doing that with intent, or otherwise. But I always think about kind of the, it's like if you play well and the cards fall the right way, right? Like if you're playing well, that's the luckiest you can be, because you'll be able to take advantage of every time you do get lucky. That like there really is a value to being disciplined, even if sometimes being disciplined is trying to get lucky. That it's really about, constantly making those calculations, and if even those momentary lapses, trying to eliminate those. Something I talked about recently with a local player at an RCQ was about concept of like A game, B game, and C game that I got from this book on poker. I think it's called Elements of Poker. It's like a free ebook that my friend AJ told me to read. We talked about how like everyone has an A game where they play like they're playing the best they can, like they're making all the right decisions, everything's coming up, they're super on top of it, they're super in. Everyone has an A game. B game about what you play normally, you're not super on, but you're playing fine. And then there's your C game, which is like your tilt game. If you're playing poker, like, nothing's coming up right, you're frustrated, you're out of it. And really, when you're evaluating kind of in his mind, he's talking about poker players. Like, when talking about a poker player, it's important to know where all three games lie, because someone who has a bad C game and doesn't have the ability to have that self-discipline to say, okay, I'm frustrated, I'm either not making good decisions, so I need to lay down this hand right now before I get into a pot that I'm going to lose too much money in. Or, if you're a Magic player and just like, I'm frustrated right now, how am I going to take the time to recenter myself rather than just say, like, oh, like, do you know that you are going to tend to be like, oh my god, this hand's terrible, so I need to mulligan, even though maybe it was a fine hand, or you're going to keep hands that are risky because you feel like the only thing that can go wrong is that you're gonna right. Like, how clear can you continue to make decisions? It's kind of a level of your C game, and I think it sounds like you're really trying to work on lifting. Right, your A game is there and can be there. Right, when you're playing with discipline and intent, it's going to be there, and you'll feel happy that you're playing and you'll be successful. Your B game, it sounds like, is has some distractions, but your C game, um, can really come out in the times where you're not able to focus a lot, and it sounds like you're trying to kind of move needle from less time playing not as well as you could into more time playing as well as you normally do, and maybe towards your best. And I think that's just a really, really good thing to be working on for a lot of people. If you're someone who feels like I've had people in coaching who've said like, oh, like the classic me is that I start 3-0 and then I lose next 3 rounds, my 6 round event, and like don't make top 8. It's like, well, is there something deeper in there? This is a question I always ask, is like, how do you feel when you're 3-0? How is it you think about things when you're 3-0 compared to when you're 0-0 round 1? What's going on there? Is it about the cards, or is it about, how you're thinking the decisions you're making? And that's something to think about and to take observation of. And so I really love that idea of discipline and intent, and really the way you put words to it. So I have a lot to say about that. I don't know what you may know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I like sort of what you both said about it. And I think it is something that is like, I think Abe called it resting rate once. Sort of like, what's it like when I'm playing? Basically, just another word like your B game per his description a second ago, which is how I've always thought of it. I've never heard of the ABC game before, which is pretty interesting. Specifically the C one, where it's like when you are getting emotional, whatever, or like frustrated, or things aren't going your way, how's it going? But regardless, I think it's really like a really good sort of moment and thing to work on. And I think it is really important to kind of be doing what you're doing. And I'm glad you're kind of on that journey and working on getting those sort of things and trying to like play Magic more engaged, if that makes sense, and less just like I am playing Magic to play Magic. Because one of the best ways to have fun, but one of the worst ways to improve, I think, is just to play, And so I think you can come to a lot of wrong conclusions if you're playing to play and not really looking at the games. You're like, oh yeah, won like 3 games in a row. Like that matchup's so easy. It's like, well, why is that matchup easy? I'm like, oh, I don't know. We're like, maybe it's not. So like, I think that stuff's really good, and I'm glad you took the time to talk to us about it. I think it's something that's very important for listeners to kind of internalize what you two said. And if you feel like that's something that you're struggling with, then you should try to tackle this problem as well.
Abe, you are last up here. Let's talk about reestablishing a depth in a range.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of fitting that we didn't pull behind the curtain. We didn't like talk necessarily about what we were going to bring to the table for this, but I feel like having just heard yours, mine actually really. It's funny, we're all kind of working on the same stuff. Crazy that improving at Magic is kind of a continuous process that has a lot of the same elements. So yeah, like you said, Spencer, what I've been working on recently has been kind of reestablishing my range, especially in Modern and Pioneer. Like Modern being the RSQ format, and Pioneer being the format for the upcoming RC and Pro Tour that I'm qualified for. And really kind of approaching both formats, which are very broad formats that are, have a lot going on in them. From a vantage of like trying to be more intentional about playing to learn. I already have a pretty strong foundation. And I say it a lot, like I have a strong foundation. Mason brought up resting rate, something we talked about like early on and kind of, hanging out in Discord calls and talking about Magic together, was like, how good do you think you would be able to, like, how well do you think you'd be able to pick up a standard deck in a random standard format you've never played before after not playing for like 3 months? And how well do you think you do? How accurate do you think you'd be with your decisions? Things like that. And I think I have a very strong foundation and resting rate because I've played a lot of Magic over the years and thought about a lot of situations really critically. And thanks to the powers of lateral thinking, I think I come in pretty strong in most scenarios. I have a really good grasp of theory, and that helps. So why is it that I would try to spend then more time, rather than honing on, decks I actually want to play, into kind of establishing range and depth across multiple decks in the format. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. So one is that like I have the strong foundation, but that means that because of just how marginal returns work, I'm not going to get as much out of playing like this modern season. I played like 2 or 3 leagues of Scam and watched some VODs of like Dingo playing some challenges, or caught some Ginger streams here and there to like get a sense for it and see it. But then I put all of my time into fringe decks and other ideas and concepts, because those are where I'm going to get the most return on things I don't already know. Right? I'm playing to learn things, and I'm going to learn the most in the first 10 to 15 matches of the deck. I'm going to understand the most and see the biggest picture from that compared to the 50th to 100th matches with the deck. And so really, given the limited time I have to play Magic Online these days, it's been my way of doing that. And really, when I'm picking up one of these new decks, it's because I want to learn like a few things about them. Is like, one, what kind of hands should I be keeping, or should my opponents when they're playing deck be keeping? This is really important. When I spent time recently playing Yawgmoth a bunch, was I played like I think like 20 or 25 matches of Yawgmoth, and I was like, okay, I now understand kind of what kind of payoff hands they can and can't keep. What are the cards they're looking to draw in situations? What plans work well in what kinds of matchups, and what's the way that things actually slot up. Like, it's one thing to think about in theory of like, okay, my sideboard plan looks like this, but then actually seeing it play out and trying to do it yourself, I think gives a really good perspective. What are this deck's strengths and weaknesses? Scales was a good example of that, of like trying to figure out what's going on here as far as why is this deck strong right now, when it looks like on paper it shouldn't really be, and how is it overcoming its inherent weaknesses, and why should I play, right, like some of these fringe decks or some of these concepts, like why would I play this deck? Why would I choose to play this deck, especially in the modern format where there's a lot of powerful decks you can play? Like, what is it exploiting, and what, and thinking about it in terms of rules of engagement, what is it that the deck that I'm trying to learn more about telling me about what the rules of engagement of the format are, right? For a deck to be successful in the first place, a deck like, Tribal Zoo has had, like Tribal Flame Zoo had a really good showing in some online tournaments recently. I know it's had really good success locally to me. And so it's like, okay, why is that? What is going on in the format that's making that happen? Answering questions like that is a really, really big part of what I'm trying to learn by trying to expand my range. And additionally, understanding kind of how those things are working just helps me be able to not only play those decks if I think they're well positioned, but exploit the things that are going on there that make them well positioned with other decks in the format. Another reason that I've been doing this is to kind of update my priors. Like, I spent a lot of time in Modern playing a lot of Hammer Time. And then Modern's changed a lot since when I first started playing that deck. Kind of getting back into the format. And same with Pioneer. I've played a lot of Mono Green, decks that are just good and strong, and some consider the best decks. But, the format has changed around it substantially. In Pioneer, for example, the Arclight Phoenix deck is, as good as, like, some people are saying it might be the best deck in the format. It's like certainly being one of the most played, or maybe it wasn't in that position, back 5 months ago in Dallas when I played Green. And so what has changed about matchups, what has changed about how they play out, is a really important thing to know, because we talked about how heuristics are dangerous, and that's even with heuristics that are up to date. For me, if I'm not spending time really playing the matches and understanding the heuristics, I'm going to walk into things with out of date heuristics. And so, like, you can imagine if I'm going in there, not just not making the active, like not thinking through all my plays or having to think through all my plays, that's going to be difficult. That's going to be a struggle on me. But if I go in not, like, with my heuristics telling me to make the wrong plays, I'm entirely set up for failure. So that's, a big part of trying to just play, some of the best decks, or, decks that I wouldn't even necessarily consider registering in a tournament, just to make sure I still have that broad range. And, formats change, matchups, and they're, the way that people configure themselves in them change, deck lists change, plans change. And theory, even though I feel like I do have a really good, like, big strength in theoretical Magic and Magic theory, like it only can tell you so much about how things are when you look at things on the deck list. There really is a cap to what that can tell you compared to what you really find to be true. And if you never take the time to find what is or isn't true, or like maybe I know how the matchup plays out just by looking at the deck lists, knowing that that's the case and that that's accurate is worth so much, because then I can continue on knowing it's true. Or if I find that it's not true, I can ask myself why I was wrong and figure out and update, the same ideas. And then with some of these decks, just I've been spending time focus testing, like the key matchups I'm trying to figure out or get a grasp on to kind of understand how they might cascade through the rest of the format. And like trying to figure out, okay, this deck is doing something cool, or it has this advantage. Is it actually viable in the broader scope of the format? Like if you have a deck that has a terrible scam matchup, but is good against a bunch of other things, like maybe Living End might be a good example of that in some metagames, where Voidwalker and Leyland Void are kind of problems, but you might be well positioned against other things. Is that like so bad that it's not a viable deck, or taking time to figure those things out, and also making sure I can understand like what makes it that way, and being able to better evaluate the matchups in those terms, especially against decks that maybe I like locally. Not talking about Travel Flame Zoo again, but the Domain Zoo deck, it was probably like half of my losses I've taken with Scam this last like 3 months of RCQs this season. I think half my losses are that deck. And so I just really took time to like play some of it to understand how it loses, play against it more, and understand how to beat it. And even though the deck is like kind of a fringe deck I need to worry about my local metagame, and I really want to understand how this deck that I think is bad, why it's beating my deck I think is better, and what's that telling me about the way I'm constructing my deck with vulnerabilities, and how to best patch those. So
for what it's worth, the deck also sees play in my metagame. I want to highlight something that you said, if you're done, and well, I want to highlight specifically how this ties into a previous episode. We had Nathan Stur on, and he talked about the ability to reverse engineer hands and plays that are available to your opponent. And I think the only way that is possible is from what Abe is doing, and being able to look at my hand versus what you've done and reverse engineer what's possible from this point, and doing it quickly can only happen if you're increasing your range, if you understand both sides of a matchup, if you understand the type of hands that a deck can even possibly keep. And if they had X, they probably don't have Y. If they did Z, they probably can't do A. And that happens through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because something that I was thinking about when I was, kind of building out what I wanted to spend my time doing as far as, improving and using, this opportunity to play a handful of, 2 to 4 leagues with a bunch of different decks to kind of continue to build on my range in these formats, was what Nathan said, actually. Like that you pointed out about like, being able to reverse engineer your opponent's hand and knowing what they're thinking and understanding what is going on there, because you can't know you might be able to figure it out based on an experience of doing it one way from one side, but you'll know so much better if you've been the player in the other seat to know what they're thinking. Like this happens to me a lot with like the Hardened Scales matchups now, where I know kind of what the importance of some of these cards are, from like the scale side of what is the real threats I need to spend my ballistic counters on, and what do I not, or how am I going to end this game, and
to Mason's point, like, understanding your opponent's heuristics and their sequencing, right? Like gives you a lot of information. Mason, I know you want to say something.
Yeah, I think one of the things that like you two both brought up that I think is really important is, like you're saying, from the playing of the decks, to understand where the player is coming from. Like what with Abe saying here, like he understands what the ballistas should be shooting, and like if it's not shooting that, maybe that means they have some different answer, or vice versa. Like Abe now knows like, hey, wow, like Patchwork Automaton is a huge problem normally I might do something different or probably not prioritize getting this extra man off this Ragavan, but I know I kind of needed to pay the War 2 for patches, and stuff like that comes up a lot. And I think I think that's all really important. One of the things that really jumped up to me about what Abe was talking about was, specifically as I look at his notes here, was kind of like what plans are performing well and what plans are performing poorly, right? And I really like kind of going in there and being like, okay, I have this strong kind of base foundation of Magic and sort of like this strong theoretical understanding. And that stuff is really good and can get you a lot of the way, but I do need to make sure that the games are actually playing out that way. And can I consistently allow for it to play that way, right? Because I think we can all attest to here, we have some thought about, hey, we're going to make the matchup play this way. We're going to marinate the game back and forth. And, I'm going to try and make this happen. And then you try and do it, and it's just a little too awkward. It's like a little too mana intensive. It requires a little bit more than you thought it would. And you're like, oh, I thought this was going to be an easy thing to have happen. And in reality, it wasn't, and that is a real truth of sort of playing the games. And so I think going back in there and kind of like updating your priors, expanding your range, sort of, et cetera, is really important. And kind of earlier to Spencer's point, right? I think a thing to talk when Spencer talked about, if you feel like you're a ramp or if you feel like you're an X player, right? Like if you identify as one type of player, I imagine you are probably there because you win a lot when you play those decks because you put a lot of work into those things and you have a lot of, heuristics understanding how those games play. And it's a self-fulfilling cycle, right? Like RCQ season comes around, right? I'm ramp guy, then it's like, okay, it's standard season. What deck am I going to play? I'm going to play ramp because I'm ramp guy. And it's like, that's what happens. And if ramp's good, then you're in a really good spot. And maybe you can even win on ramps, just fine. But, it will hurt you long term if you box yourself in. And so while you might go and compete at the RCQ playing the ramp deck because it's your best deck to win, you can be at home doing what Abe's doing and playing Esper and Soldiers and Mono Red and trying to expand that range. And no one's saying that, like, hey, you've got to do what Abe's doing at tournaments too, like I don't think Abe's out here going like, all right, it's Lutri time at the RCQ, and he like queues up the Lutri deck at his weekend event. Like he is spending the time at home practicing those things, and when he goes to the event, he plays Rakdos Scam. And I really resonated. The last thing I'll say here is I really resonated with what Abe said about, I spent 2-3 leagues playing Scam, and then I, went and started doing all the other things, right? I sort of got my, priors up to date on Scam, felt good about these things. And I wanted to see how all these other decks played, which you spent a lot of time talking about. But I really resonate with that because that's how I approach a lot of the formats where it's like I want to understand everything that's going on there, and especially 4-color, where, that whole time Yorgon was legal, I can literally tell you all my league games because I remember them because there are so few of them, and I didn't play much with Yorgon on Moto, but I played a ton of Moto and I played a lot of all the other decks to get an understanding for how their deck worked, how they were feeling, so I could attack it as a control deck. And when you're a deck that has a lot of interaction, understanding truly their strengths inside and out is an important part. Like Abe mentioned, at the start of all this, now I know what the ballista matters versus not mattering, right? And this all sort of ties together. And so I think it's a really big part of it. And is underappreciated by players because players love to get their 100th game in with a deck, and there are seriously diminishing returns. I would say this, like differing levels of play skill, you're gonna have different, amounts of knowledge or something, but I find it hard to believe the 101st game is really like, that has to be the point of tipping for 99% of players, especially if you found our constructed podcasts on, Spotify or whatever. If you're seeking this stuff out, I doubt you're at the spot where, your 200th game with Soldiers is really telling you a lot.
Yeah, and I really love that you touched on that as far as like, I'm not using that range to like the range I'm trying to build to necessarily be able to like switch decks every week or, just to enjoy playing with different decks. Like I'm playing a lot in this way to like go forward to put it into practice, like taking it one step further as far as, not only am I spending this time to understand these decks, be able to play them, keep in my back pocket, but I'm playing it with intent to be able to, know what's going on in not just the best decks, but these decks that are kind of fringe and why they're seeing success. What that says about the rules of engagement. For example, like when I started playing Hammer, one of the big decks was the Asmo deck, right? That was like right around the start of of MH2 being in the format, and a big reason that deck was so good was because Urza Saga was like just one of the best cards. The amount of power put into play and its like versatility was so good that then seeing, okay, how can we take that and put it into a different shell that works a little better? Or is that even strong right now or weak right now? Like being able to answer those questions about what the good cards are and what you can maybe learn from seeing a deck that you know is not the strongest deck in the format, right? It's not, especially right now in Modern, it's really apparent, right? Like Rakdos Scam is just the most played deck and fairly dominant and just about everywhere for a good reason. But there still are decks that succeed. So what does that say about what's going on in the format on a format level, and what are the rules of engagement right now in the format, and how are those decks doing that right? All of that is valuable information that I'm trying to tap into, so I can either avoid being exploited if I'm playing a deck like Rakdos Scam, or exploited if I think one of those decks is in a good place. And kind of expounding onto like why it is that this is something I'm working on is right. Like I've got a Pro Tour coming up. It is so important at that level to be on the cutting edge and not be a week behind. Because if you're a week behind, you are going to get eaten up by the competition. I have absolutely been a week behind before my first Pro Tour. I was definitely a week, maybe two behind of what I should have been playing, and I felt it. My deck was not good. Compared to my second Pro Tour, where I felt like my deck was like one of the best decks for the tournament, and I felt really good about my constructed rounds. And especially for formats like Pioneer and Modern, where only so much can change because they're non-rotating, like having the ability to feel comfortable playing a bunch of these decks and also like identify the opportunities for them is going to be really important for that process for me for this Pro Tour. And also, as we're going back into seasonal Magic and I have less time than I used to, kind of back in the idea of resting rate, like having this strong foundation of range now means that when we come back around to Pioneer season or to Modern season, or even like, once I'm doing this with Standard and then we're coming back around to Standard season, I'll have hopefully a good picture of where things are and where they're at, or at least a closer snapshot of what I'm looking at than where I was. And so that's kind of like the big picture of why it is that this is what I've been working on, and how it's like can be so much more useful to you, especially where like lateral thinking is the most important thing of my process. Like without the ability to do that, I'm not sure that following a process like this will work for you, which is why I'm always so big on talking about how developing that skill is really, really valuable. But right, like leveraging all this information and sliding it around to make a bigger picture is really like the goal behind what I've been doing. So I don't know if you guys have any last thoughts, but that's my always improving this week.
Love it. If you want to join the show, one of the best ways to do that is to head over to the Patreon. You can ask the Patreon questions, or if you're part of the Discord. Joshua asks, with the RC in Atlanta be my fourth RC, and not top 48ing any of the previous three, how should I view the results of this tournament if I don't queue for the PT? While not being results oriented, but at some point, not finishing 4 RCs in a row does say something, or am I way off? Yeah, I think that's just results oriented thinking for what it's worth. I could probably speak for all of us. We probably all did a lot of PTQs, RCQs, PPTQs before we finished and went to the Pro Tour. I top 8'd, I think it was my second PTQ. Didn't top 8 another PTQ for a little bit. It just happens. Like there's so much that goes into a given tournament. When you think about like the regional championships rather than like even just the old school PTQ system, I think there's a level of this is more like trying to like it's like your one shot to catch a GP almost in order to make a Pro Tour. If you could only make Pro Tours from GPs back in the day, it's kind of how I think of this. it's hard. It's like it's hard for like a lot of different reasons, and you don't know which knob to turn for the reason that it didn't work out, right? And so to me, it's about like adjusting, like, okay, some self-reflection. What knob can I adjust that I think that I could have done better on, and going into the next one with that while trying to maintain the other things, right? And if you're shifting all these knobs at once, right, which is something that I did after. I remember, I lost like three like PDU PDU top eights in a row, like in a row at one point, and I was like, I'm just gonna shift my entire Magic game. Like, I'm gonna completely change like how I test, who I test with, what I'm thinking, the decks that I've like. I just shifted everything. I think I missed a whole year of PDQ top eights when I did that. And you just have to be realistic and understand that there are things outside of your control, and focus on the things that you can control. That's my answer to this question. Mason?
Hey, Abe, I got a question for you here. If you want to tag team this one with me, how many RCQs have you played this season?
How many RSQs have I played this season?
Yeah.
I think 6 or 7.
6 or 7 without a win in a row. It's got to say something. Where my way off? You know what I mean? That to me, it's like winning an RCQ is like much. It's around the same thing, right? Like it's all the same. Like it doesn't really matter. Like if you lost 4 RCQs or whatever, I don't think you would. Maybe you would, Joshua. You don't think you'd be like, yeah, even let's say 8 RCQs. Like, yeah, I've lost 8 of them. Like I gotta say something, right? Like they're just sample sizes, and these things feel bigger because they are bigger, and you put a lot of importance, you put a lot of weight, and you spend a lot of money to travel to these things, and you dedicate your weekends, and you take time off work, and you practice with your friends after work, and with all the commitments. And I'm not saying it's not a big deal, it's not happening. I'm more just saying you have taken a very small number of shots at this very small number of people who actually make it. And I think you're being a little too hard on yourself. Worth noting, it is only top 32 as of this next RC. It's no longer 48. There's only 32 invites to the United States, which does make it harder. But even at 48 or whatever, I think the average RC was just about over 1,000 people, right? Like the first one was a little bit smaller, I think. And then like California was like 1,300. And then it was like 1,100 for Dallas. So I guess it's even a little higher than I'm saying. That is like a very small portion of the room who actually gets Pro Tour invites. And lots of great players miss Pro Tour invites, right? I don't think Mike Sigris qualified for any of the Pro Tours via the RC or whatever this past year, and Mike Sigris is a great player, right? He is really, really strong. If someone told me I have Mike Sigris play for my life for a random person, I'm taking Siggy. I'm not taking the random person. And
Former player of the year, Mike Sigris.
Yeah, player of the year, incredibly strong, limited. If it's limited, prying from my hands, and stop it. I won't take 3 rerolls. You know what I mean? And so like, this is a thing where it's just, I think you're being really hard. And I think you are, like Spencer said, you're being results oriented. I understand that it's hard to not be result oriented in the thing that only really pays off the top. And in some ways, I wish more people got RC invites from like day 2ing or something. I wish there was like a point-ish system, but that's not the world we live in. And so I try not to think about things that aren't the world we live in. And so regardless, what I should say is try not to fixate on things that aren't in the world we live in. And so I think it's just important to be like, listen, if you don't make up this 4th one, instead of being like, does this say something about me as a player? It should probably say something about, hey, what does this mean as the process? And is this something that I'm okay with doing? Because Magic is a marathon, not a race. Most people don't get there. They just do not make it there. A lot of people will play at least one Pro Tour, and if they compete long enough, they will get there, right? But to really do it, if you really want to compete a lot, you need to be okay with failure, because Magic tournaments pump out losers, not winner. Only one person wins, right? And so you need to be focused on improving, getting better, and moving forward, kind of like the point of the show. If you're not getting better, what are you doing? We need to work on those things. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I really love everything you guys said. I think the only thing I would add or rephrase is like, if you do not qualify on your 4th RC, You know, like the question you should ask yourself is, it does say something, which is that you didn't do it right. But the question you need to ask yourself is, what is that thing? What is that something that it's saying? Are you happy with how you prepared for those tournaments? Are you happy with how you felt playing those matches? Are you happy with the results of the process that you put in place, right? Not in the sense of, I got 33rd place, so now I don't go to the Pro Tour and I'm unhappy. I think that'd be hard to say. Like, if you got 33rd on tiebreakers, the process you followed was probably pretty good. You're going to beat out over 1,000 people to get that finish, right? 1,000 people who also put in time and effort and, took time to travel there and wanted to win and, came in to play all these matches, won their own RCQs, qualified on their own means. But are you happy with how you got to that 33rd place? Like if you played the tournament and all of your opponents mulligan to 4 every round and you top 32'd, would you be happy with that result? Like, that honestly matters so much more than what qualification you come out with at the end of it, or what prize you earn, is knowing, are you happy or not with how things happened, and then identifying, okay, if I'm not happy or what I'm not happy with, in terms of like, right, I haven't seen improvement out of these last RCs, I haven't felt good about the decks I've chosen, or the games I've played, whatever it is, use that as feedback, rather than saying, am I doing everything wrong? Should I just give up? Is like, okay, what of what I'm doing is working and not, so you can use it as feedback to really target where you want to improve. That's what I would say. I think you are way off about it saying something in the way that you're implying, but you're not at all way off in it saying something. It's just you need to make sure you're identifying what that is correctly.
I would have got 33rd, by the way. Sorry, I got 33rd last year in Atlanta. So if I were to repeat my performance, which was a very good performance, I would miss the Pro Tour. I ended up drawing the last round, but I would obviously not be able to draw in that spot.
Yeah, I got 48th.
Yeah. So Abe and I both that cusp and like the new cusp, like it's there and it's hard to do. So no shame in it either.
Yeah, I want to jump in on something that you said. I was coaching a player for the RC in San Diego, and they lost a double win in it. And we hugged and I cheered them on and stuff, and it was a hard loss, but during the coaching process and afterwards, did you understand the format? Yes. Did you play the right deck? Do you feel like you played the right deck? Yes. Were you happy with your play? Yes. Did you, would you change anything? No. Was it a successful tournament? And they ended up saying yes. Like they were happy with where they ended up, how they ended up. You sometimes things don't break your way. Right? And I think that if you're focusing on the right things, like Abe said, and the things that you can control, it won't matter what the result is. It will matter to you personally if you put your best foot forward, and can stand on what you did and what you believed in going into the event. So.
Yeah, results don't matter. I love what you said there, Spencer.
If you want to join the conversation, you can join the Patreon Discord by becoming a patron of $5 or more. You can join the public Discord. I haven't checked yet. We got a fantasy football league for He's the Game Media going on. I'm in a tight one right now. After this, maybe I'll check that. We also talked about things like, everything in your culture, Souls of Magic, the aspiring Spike, invisible stalker screenshot made multiple Discords today for me. That was too funny. You can also leave a YouTube comment. We didn't have a YouTube comment this week, but I will say that we got a couple of them of people like, oh, I can't believe I just learned of this podcast for the first time or listened to this episode for this time. We love those comments, and they actually do drive engagement, and they help the show a lot. But I just want to say, I was sending these guys some podcast numbers this week, and just the the growth in the show of people sharing it and people talking about it and things like that has been really evident the last 90 days. And we really appreciate it. It does not go unnoticed, and I just want to call that out. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at CCMTG. And you can check out Drafting Archetypes every week at constructivecriticism.com. The best ways to support the show are always to like, subscribe, review, and comment. Where can people find you, Abe?
You can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. DMs are open for coaching if you're looking for someone who isn't Mason, someone who's less handsome and less tall.
Dude, I was gonna say Mason's beard looks really good today. Like, if you're watching the podcast, I don't know if it's the lighting. Did you just trim that? It looks fresh.
It looked like
it looks really what? Really handsome? Really good? Really bad?
Really bad.
No,
really bad.
You broke up.
You broke.
I broke up.
Yeah, you was like Mason's beard looks, and then I was like,
said really fresh. That's so funny.
Thank you. That's funny. Thank you.
You said Mason's beard looks really, and then Roundabout started playing.
Yeah, that's so really good. I could still say the listeners could still hear me for what it's worth. So
that's funny. Yeah,
Mason, where do you find you?
You can find me over at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. You can find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can reach out to me for coaching there or via my email, masoneclark@gmail.com. Put coaching in the description. That way I know you're not spam. Or if you are spam, you're getting me a little bit better that way. I click on it. And that's where you can find me. Spencer, where can people find you?
You can find me at Heezy Game on Twitter. I did open my DMs and notice some coaching opportunities. I really appreciate people reaching out, especially during this time for me. You can find me on the Need to Nerd podcast, podcast. We did Cobra Kai season 4. We're doing Witcher season 1 next week. It's a really fun show. And then tomorrow I'm recording a really cool tips and tricks episode of Smash Bros. Ultimate on Smash Through, the always improving podcast about Smash Bros. Ultimate. What did we learn on the show this week? I'll go first. I think that my biggest learning was I had heard, I think it was because Mason wasn't on the episode where we talked about A game, B game, and C game. I think he was out when we did that, Abe. But you reiterated it this week, and it made me think more about my B game and things that I can do to improve there to lift as well. So that was really interesting to me. What about you, Mason?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it a little bit in passing earlier about the ABC with A, but specifically the idea of the C game. I mean, what I tell people a lot in Magic and in coaching is that, like, when you are tilting, it is good to, like, push those feelings down and aside and the rest of your life to be mad at yourself for that misplay that you made and not to really worry about it. And, you know, for some people that's easier than others. And just the idea of that is really interesting. It makes me kind of want to investigate some of that literature just to sort of see what other people have said about it. But that was my biggest one. Hey, what about you?
Yeah, so mine was actually thinking a little bit about, like, more about what you had talked about, Mason, in terms of, like, kind of the whole thing about heuristics and the value of them as tools to offload your thinking. But something I didn't get a chance to say that I kind of thought of while I was thinking about it while Spencer was talking about his topic. Sorry to cut into that time you had, Spencer. But is the same idea of, like, deviation from, like, the correct or, like, optimal thing being how, you know, in poker it is that you wind up capturing advantage, or, like, the idea of, like, wins above replacement as a stat in baseball, of, like, how you evaluate players who are good in their position being how much more than, like, a replacement level player are they, and how that really applies to Magic and how they're deviating from heuristics and being able to perform better than what is just the, you know, competent player number 45 steps into your match, sits down at a table across from you and plays that game, or sits down in that same seat as you and plays the same cards. How much more often than them are you winning? And how deviating from heuristics can really help that.
The Rudy Gobert plus minus stat, as some would say. So, yeah, I love it.
Exactly.
I love it. that's a fun topic. That's a bonus episode topic if ever I've heard one, for what it's worth. Speaking of, get your Patreon questions in for a mailbag episode. We have enough to do one this month. So if you want to hear yours heard on the show, please make sure to get those in. Thank you everybody so much for listening. I really loved this episode. I want to give a shout out to Mason for suggesting it on a week that we had to find a replacement topic. Mason, it was great, and we appreciate it. And we'll see everybody next week on another episode of Constructed Criticism.